Welcome everyone to today's observability clinic. It's about automating application security to detect and remediate vulnerabilities like Log4Shell. Security is top of our mind. We get constantly reminded about that there are new vulnerabilities out there. Dynatrace has been active in security for a while. And in order to learn more about this, I invited somebody that has been helping customers over the last months and even years on applying and rolling out Dynatrace AppSec. Daniel, welcome to my observability clinic.
Thanks, Andy, for having me.
Hey, Daniel, can you, I think we want to jump right into the topic. We want to make it crisp. We want to show people what Dynatrace application security looks like. I know Log4Shell is still top of our mind, but I want to go broader just in general, even though Log4Shell is obviously something we all know. So take it away. Show us what Dynatrace AppSec is all about and why it's different to anything else out there in the market.
Right. So before we actually jump into a live demo or some differentiation what Dynatrace actually can do to your application security tooling landscape, because I'm pretty sure you already have quite some application security tooling out there. Let's have first a look at what Dynatrace AppSec looks like. It's essentially giving you a list of all vulnerabilities that Dynatrace finds in your production environment, and this is essentially what Dynatrace does, and also what other tools pretty much can't do. Right. So let's have a closer look at that. So, what are the three questions that in situations like where a new vulnerability is published, like the Log4Shell, what happened in December, or in general, right? If you are just want to know, are we vulnerable, right? Mm-hmm. And then obviously the follow-up questions are, if you know you're vulnerable, at what scale am I vulnerable, and where do I start? Essentially it's prioritization, right? And so I want to have a closer look at all these three questions and then revisit all those three throughout a live demo. Mm-hmm. So first one, are we vulnerable, right? And essentially the traditional application security tooling that is out there is essentially further on the left of your software development lifecycle or at the perimeter, right? Those mm-hmm. are where most of the application security tooling, if not all, is essentially located, right? And the questions that are actually answered by those tools are, is our code base vulnerable, right? Because mm-hmm. you essentially point a static tool to a repository and want to know how many occurrences, let's say, of Log4J, and what versions do I have in my code base, right? Mm-hmm. So you answer that question, and with the perimeter tooling, you essentially, scan endpoints or things like that, or maybe even look at, hosts. You might be able to find out how many hosts do I have where I find a Log4J file or, Log4J in the file name. But that still doesn't really answer the question, is the codes that or the applications that are run in production, are they vulnerable, right? So you're sort of dancing around a bit of the problem, right? You get an indication, of course, if is your code base vulnerable to some extent influences if your production environment is vulnerable, right? But it's still not the same question, and the gap is always there, right? It might be bigger and smaller depending on how mature the automation of your software development lifecycle is and how frequently you deploy and things like that. But you will most likely not be able to answer if you don't have anything in production that monitors 24/7 for vulnerabilities like Dynatrace does, to really precisely answer the question if you're vulnerable or not, right? Mm-hmm. So that is a very important gap. The gap is most likely always there. It's larger or smaller depending on the maturity of your tooling and the grade of automation that you have. But of all the customers and all the feedback that we see out there, it is essentially always there. Mm-hmm. Now, the next question, at what scale are we vulnerable? Or if we are vulnerable, if we answer that, what's the scale of it, right? And again, the traditional application security tooling essentially answers, how many repositories or how many occurrences, I found Log4J that many times in that versions in my code base, right? And the traditional perimeter tooling would tell you, I found you could be exploited on those endpoints with that type of payload, right? So, but it still doesn't answer you the questions, how many applications or what applications, how many clusters, how many Kubernetes clusters, how many containers, how many container images, what are those container images, and how many hosts? Is it one host? Is it 1,000 hosts, right? That I, what the scope of my problem is, right? Or how many processes, right? So that is all pressing questions that customers or, organizations want and need to be able to answer, but they are still not able to do that with the existing tooling they have today. Now, the third one is, where do we start? And, I'm essentially jumping directly to, stating or, summarizing there. And again, the tooling that's out there essentially gives you a flat list of, this is what we found. There is some sort of, prioritization there, which is essentially, a CVSS core, but it's still, the CVSS core coming from the publisher, like NVD, for instance, right? Which means it doesn't understand how you use a library in your application, right? So the vulnerability always comes with the score that it's, published with, but it has no idea of how you're using it in your deployment, right? And you also really can answer that if you are not really looking at the runtime information out there, because only when you are at runtime, what an observability solution like Dynatrace is doing, it can automatically build, a topology map that pretty much, I think all of you are familiar with, plus then obviously analyze the topology automatically with, Davis, and that puts you in a position where you automatically, or where Dynatrace does for you, an automatic prioritization, right? So again, it's the gap that Dynatrace fills in, right? So in summary, are we vulnerable? At what scale? And where do we start? All can be answered really straightforward and really simple with Dynatrace application security. And I'd like to show you now how it's done in the live demo.
Pretty cool. Thank you for the overview. And I want to just highlight and kind of recap again what I just learned is, on the one side, you basically tell me the traditional tools that maybe just scan code bases or directories for the existence of a certain piece of code or a certain library obviously is not accurate enough, because we don't even know, maybe somebody put a file in a temp folder, or maybe it's still there because of a backup. And just the existence of a file on a file system doesn't really tell you if it's really used. On the other side, if we have scanning tools as part of a software delivery cycle that may scan, does a container contain a vulnerable library, doesn't tell you, is the container running at all? Is it exposed to the outside world? And also, do we have one instance or thousands of instances? And I think these are some of the questions that I guess, as somebody that is, let's say, normally secure aware, never thought of. And I think this is great that you are putting out these questions and also showing what traditional approaches do and what they're actually missing. And now, thanks for the live. Go ahead. Let's go on to the live demo.
Sure. All right. So let me directly start at the screen that I introduced already before. So as soon as Dynatrace is enabled, Dynatrace application security is enabled in your environment, it essentially gives you all the vulnerabilities that it found, right? And I'd like to compare that to sort of the first install that people do with Dynatrace, right? And when they see for the first time how the Smartscape unfolds in front of their eyes, and some people always say, it's like magic, because Dynatrace automatically understands how your production deployment looks like, all the dependencies, and building essentially a true cause and effect relationship model of your application, right? And it's very similar to that is when people get an application security license, and they get a list of all their vulnerabilities in production, right? It's a similar magic moment, and it at the same time, it's people didn't really think about that, right? Because the common impression is out there, or the common understanding, if I've checked my code base, there can't be any vulnerabilities in production, and the reality there is it's not, right? Because there is so many ways of introducing vulnerable libraries into a production environment between or after you scanned your code base for the last time, before essentially putting it in your pipeline, right? All right, so how, let's spend a couple of minutes on the screen. So essentially, what it does, it's it's observing, like the rest of Dynatrace works. It's observability, so it's 24/7 continuously monitoring for vulnerabilities, right? So what does that do for you? So two things. First is whenever a new vulnerability is published, and this is not unheard of if you just look a month back, right? A new vulnerability with quite severe Log4Shell was published, and our customers immediately become aware or whether or not if they are affected within 15 minutes after it was published, right? No scans, no recycling or retriggering any scripts of essentially rescanning or anything like that. Vulnerability got published. 15 minutes later, you get a complete overview whether or not you have been affected. And I come to those two questions, at what scale and where do I start later. And the other thing is, whenever a new deployment happens, you automatically become aware of if that has a vulnerability in there as well, right? So you get essentially both of best of two worlds, essentially, right? And in other words, whenever there is a change, either in the vulnerabilities or non-vulnerabilities or in your code, deployment setup, essentially, you will be automatically be covered, right? That's essentially a huge benefit, right? So now, let's get started with that here with the list below, right? So in all management zones across the Dynatrace footprint, we found here in my demo environment 262 vulnerabilities, right? That in real production environments can be a little bit overwhelming. So I wanted to show different views on where to how or a better way of getting started, right? And a very important one is, for instance, the management zones, right? So if I say I'm responsible for the application on guard, I could drill into that management zone, and I'm now down to 100 vulnerabilities, right? So that's the first thing I could do if I have a limited responsibility. Then the next thing is the Davis security score. I come a little bit later to how that works in detail, but essentially it was the third question that I tried to address here, right? And what it does for you is it makes sure that the really critical ones remain standing out, right? So in my case here, I have only 2 critical vulnerabilities, and then I'll already drop below, or into the high criticality prioritization, right? And if you are not doing that, you typically have dozens or if not hundreds critical vulnerabilities, right? And what the Davis security score is doing, it bends the curve, right? So it makes sure that the really critical ones keep standing out versus the rest of them are pushed down a bit, right? And essentially, it's again, I come to that later a bit, on how it works. And the third thing is you have the Davis Security Advisor, and it essentially tells you from a library perspective, where you have the biggest impact, right? And for instance, it tells me if I would upgrade Log4j Core, I would solve 2 critical vulnerabilities, right? These are the 2 ones down here, plus 4 more, or in total 4 vulnerabilities, right? If I would, upgrade Jackson Data Bind, I would solve 42 high and in total 46 vulnerabilities and so forth, right? So it's different ways of looking at it. First is per application. The other one is, within my application or in total, how many or which vulnerabilities do I start with? And then again, if I would think of, remediation or library perspective, I would have the Data Security Advisor, right? So those are different ways of, getting started with the list of vulnerabilities. Now, of course, everybody wants to, what Dynatrace does for Log4j. So let me drill into here. But I'd like to then come back and go into a lower prioritization one to really explain what the Davis security score is doing for you. Now, Log4j. I mean, no surprise, obviously our demo environment is affected as well by the Log4Shell vulnerability. And you know, question number one we've answered, right? We are affected. And we didn't need to do anything, right? No scans, no sending hundreds of Java developers to investigate in their code base and other, you know, things that people did to respond to that vulnerability. Second is, you know, to what extent, second question was, to what extent am I, you know, or what's the scope, right? And Dynatrace has a very interesting way of analyzing that, right? So imagine a smartscape again, right? So we found that or let's start even at a level below, right? So Dynatrace detected the vulnerability, you know, remote code execution, Log4Shell. We detected 2 libraries that are out there. And then we found out that this library was identified in 6 JVMs across your deployment, and a version 2.14 was identified once, right? Now we identify that, and now traversing the smartscape to answer, you know, what processes, they're listed over here, what processes, what JVMs essentially are affected, on what hosts do they run, you know, what services do those JVMs host, ultimately what applications are serviced, and then in the other direction, you know, what's the data, the connected data things to that application, you know, what's my Kubernetes workloads, what's my Kubernetes clusters, right? All right there. And as you know, Dynatrace, you can drill into any of those, right? I can drill into my application, see how, you know, what essentially put my end user's perspective on that. I could drill into any of those hosts. I could, you know, investigate my Kubernetes workloads, clusters, and so forth, right?
So Daniel, if I can quickly ask a question, because I think this is very important. That means if I have a critical vulnerability like Log4Shell and somebody would compromise my system and basically get access to that process, I know here what this process, where it runs on, which systems it's connected to. That means potentially I could say, if I'm not fixing this vulnerability, somebody could have access A to that database, B to the Kubernetes cluster, C to that particular host. And I think this is really the magic, because we don't not only know if there's, hey, you know, because it could be a completely isolated process that nobody cares about. But in this case, it's a process that is well connected to very critical pieces of the infrastructure.
Within the application that we are observing, right?
Exactly.
So spot on, right? Now Dynatrace also tells you, you know, what container images that are, and this is also very important, because a container image typically directly points you to the responsible team that's, you know, that the container image is, you know, or was produced or is responsible for. And as you said before, you know, and in this case, Davis Security Score didn't do any adjustment, because it, you know, as you described it before, it's a very well connected process. So it's exposed to the internet, it has access to sensitive data assets, and therefore it didn't adjust, you know, the criticality of the problem, right? So again, I want to come back to that later to understand, you know, to better demonstrate what the Davis Security Score is doing, right? But yeah, that's pretty much it. So, you know, we have all the details now to understand, you know, we know that we are affected and we know to what extent. But let me still do a little bit more analysis here. So or show a little bit more of the screen, right? So Dynatrace told you that, you know, 4 affected processes were related to that specific vulnerability, right? You can also drill into any of those vulnerability catalogs to read more about the vulnerability. But also you can get a complete overview about all the process groups that Dynatrace detected the vulnerability in, right? And that's important because it essentially keeps track of your remediation activities, right? So in my case, we found that in 5 process groups, this vulnerability is already solved, right? And again, this is not a manual effort, but completely automatically detected by Dynatrace, because as soon as you essentially remediate the vulnerability and redeploy, and it, you know, the vulnerable Log4J version is no longer identified within the process group, Dynatrace would automatically, put the state to resolved, right? And this is essentially how you keep track of your remediation activities, right? Or in other words, keeps you laser focused on what you have still to do, right? And I still have 4 process groups where this vulnerability is found, and you get additional information about whether or not that process group has public exposure or access to a database, right? So if I would now need to call priorities, I would get started with the first 2 ones, right? Because they're publicly exposed and have access to vulnerable data, versus the third one seems to be more of an isolated process group, and the last one is publicly exposed but isn't able to access a database, or is not accessing a database, I should say. Right, so this is great, and I could even say, after some more investigation, this seems to be something I don't want to prioritize on right now. I could, essentially mute that vulnerability and see, I would like to look at it later, or the configuration, or this one is not affected, and essentially mute that, right? So you are in full of control, and it helps you to keep track of your remediation process, right? So let's go back to the overview, and then dive into, for instance, I don't know, for instance, that remote code execution 8.6. And as you can see, the screen is the same, and I'm not going into, reiterating on all that, but I want to focus on the data security score, right? So off the shelf, so CSS base is a 9.8. It would be a critical vulnerability, right? But now, after Dynatrace understood how that process essentially, or that vulnerability run or occurs in your environment, if you want, right? It can make adjustments, and it essentially says, it is publicly connected, so we are not changing the score, right? But it's not, there is no database within range. So, again, Davis is traversing Smartscape, and it can't find a database that's connected to the vulnerable process. So that allows for lowering the risk score, right? And you end up with an 8.6 high risk, problem instead of a 9.8, right? And again, the really important thing is, if you do that across the board, across hundreds of vulnerabilities, you essentially end up with, look at those 5 and not look at those 100, right?
And I think that's
obviously you need to address everything at some point, but it gives you, it gives you a good, sort of map where to start, what to do next, and things like that, right?
Exactly. And I think this is also what I just want to reiterate, because we only have so much time and capacity to fix things, right? Your security teams, while you may have a large security team, you only have certain time slots that you can deal with this. And if Dynatrace prioritizes this for you to really focus on the high vulnerability exposures, then this is very helpful to focus on the right things and not just run around and just try to fix everything. Yeah. Wow, that's really amazing.
That already brings me to the end of my live demo. So we addressed, am I affected? What's the scope? To what extent I'm affected, and where to start. And there were 3 angles. The data security score is helping there. The data security advisor is helping from a library perspective, or library upgrade remediation perspective. And then, of course, you can do whatever you're familiar with, or all the essentially other tooling that you're familiar with, like management zones and filtering. You can work with that as well. Also, last comment: everything that you saw on the screens right now is also accessible through APIs. So you can build that into your automation scripts. You can build other integration points and whatever tooling you want to do to make this really completely automated and put that into your pipeline automation.
Yeah, exactly. And I want to also highlight here another observability clinic I did with Christoph Renders, where we showed how to include these security capabilities into your delivery pipeline. We talk about security quality gates. That means as part of your delivery pipeline, you can use Dynatrace data to act as quality gate indicators, right? Shall you push a new code piece into the next stage if you know that you have a critical vulnerability, yes or no? And these are things we have covered. Daniel, one more question. So these are so-called security problems. That means, are they also then triggering problem integrations in Dynatrace. That means, can I trigger a, I don't know, creating a ticket in Jira? Can I create a ServiceNow workflow? Can I create a Captain Auto remediation workflow or trigger that?
Yeah, so they are separated, right? So you have to put the performance problems, and security or vulnerabilities are not, creating that, category of problems, right? I'll show a little bit more later. Of course, you can, first of all, use the APIs, as previously said, to build automation. And out of the box, it's possible, if you go into your settings, to have a webhook, push notification that,
Perfect.
for instance, can be used for Slack or Teams or anything else you'd like to do. And there is also an out of the box Jira, push notification there, right? So those are the two things that are out there, plus the API.
Perfect. Yeah, and the API is super powerful because, and I think besides the API, I think what you didn't mention, there's also metrics. You have shown earlier that we are categorizing security problems into critical, high, medium, and low, I guess. And you also have the capability to query metrics, like how many open, high critical problems do you have right now? How many are new? How many have been closed? So I think also from a metrics perspective, it's really great. Because you can use obviously metrics for your dashboarding, for your reporting, and also for any type of alerting or keeping track of status. Yeah,
I didn't go into that, but it's a good call. We should actually, close the demo here with the security overview, and that's just highlighting a couple of those metrics that you mentioned, Andy, right? So it's essentially new vulnerabilities over time and total vulnerabilities, but that's also available through the Metrics Explorer, and you can now bring essentially security metrics to your established dashboards, right? So that's the idea there.
Perfect. Daniel, thank you. I think let's close with the topic that is still top of most of our minds. Just to recap.
So I wanna close my part of the clinic with the summary, essentially how Dynatrace detected the Log4Shell vulnerability. And again, this is a very nice timeline, and Chris Randers put together that slide, and it shows when the vulnerability was listed on GitHub, when it was listed on NVD, and then right thereafter it was listed on Snyk, which is the essentially leading vulnerability catalog out there. And Dynatrace detected it quickly thereafter, right? So it, as you can see from the timeline, it was essentially a 20-minute delay from when the vulnerability was published until Dynatrace essentially detected it in production environments, right? So you quickly knew if you're affected, and once you use Dynatrace, you could answer all those other questions very straightforward.
Pretty impressive. And also, by the way, I know there was different blog posts were published, and maybe Daniel, if you want to go to the next slide with the overview of all the additional material, there's so much content that you, Christoph, Assad have created. I know there's a new one that was just published, I think last week, from Michael Krieger. He's one of our colleagues, and he basically says how we're using Dynatrace internally to monitor our own security vulnerability exposures, and how we can obviously assure our customers that we are not victims of those vulnerabilities, and we are using our own capabilities on our in our own SDLC. And I think that's really nice to see how it works internally. Daniel, I fear this is not the last time we hear about things like Log4Shell, right? I'm pretty sure. I assume, unfortunately, that people will have to spend their weekends and maybe even holidays in fighting vulnerabilities. I do hope, however, that people will see how powerful Dynatrace is in that respect, and how much more focused those teams can then work on fixing vulnerabilities, those that really matters. And is there any final statement, maybe Daniel, if somebody wants to get started with it? You mentioned some licensing model, but there's nothing new you need to install, correct? It's just really turning on a capability in Dynatrace.
Essentially, there is two ways: either reach out to your contact, that you are in contact anyway at Dynatrace, or just use the in-product chat, reach out to Dynatrace and tell us you would like to explore Dynatrace application security, and we make sure to get you started.
Cool. Well, with this, I want to say thank you, Daniel, again. I'm sure I will have you back because I know there's a lot of stuff coming still in application security on Dynatrace, what we have on the roadmap. So detecting vulnerabilities like this is just the start. Just the start, exactly. It's going to be exciting times. And security is very important. So, and we want to do our best to help the industry here. Thank you and all the best. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Andy. Bye.